Today, people are familiar with the Bible, which is actually a collection of ancient books that have been bound together under a single cover. This form of a book is called Codex, but it wasn't the standard type of book in the ancient world. So, why do we have a Bible Codex? That leads to a mystery from the beginning of Christianity. It's probably one you've never heard of, and it may be something you've never even thought about. But when Christianity burst onto the world stage, it brought something new with it. It brought a revolution in book technology. And today, I'm going to tell you a detective story that we still haven't completely solved. Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making this podcast for years to come and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. In the ancient world, there were two forms of books, the scroll and the codex. As everybody knows, scrolls were long rolls that you had to roll and unroll to read. They had the pages attached side by side to make a long continuous strip. Codices, by contrast, were like modern books. They had the pages attached to a spine, allowing you to quickly flip from one passage to another. These two types of books amounted to different forms of book technology. They worked in different ways, as the ways of accessing the material, rolling versus flipping, indicates. Before the rise of Christianity, scrolls were by far the most popular form for books. We have almost no references to pre-Christian books being sold in codex form, and pagans and Jews used scrolls almost exclusively when they had scribes copy books for them. There was some use of codices in pre-Christian times, but people tended to use them for minor tasks like taking notes, the way we use spiral notebooks. But the idea of publishing something as impressive as a finished book, a work of literature in the form of a notepad, well, that was hard to imagine. By contrast, Christians were enthusiastic users of codices. This is clear from the surviving 2nd and 3rd century Christian manuscripts, the large majority of which are in codex form. In the show notes or video description, I'll have a link to the American scholar Larry Hurtado's catalog of 2nd and 3rd century Christian manuscripts so you can see for yourself. Scholars have debated why the Codex became so popular among Christians, and they've proposed many possible reasons. However, we don't really know for sure. Codices have some advantages over scrolls, but these aren't decisive. If you'd like to read more about that, see Larry Hurtado's book, The Earliest Christian Artifacts, and Harry Y. Gamble's book, Books and Readers in the Early Church. Whatever the case, the Christian use of codices started a trend that led to the codex becoming the modern form of the book all over the world that we use today instead of the scroll. The primary reason Christians started using codices was likely cultural. Somebody in the Christian community started producing books in codex form, and it caught on. This probably happened at first with a very influential edition of a major Christian text, likely something that's now part of the Bible, and this became the expected form for books among Christians. The codex form of books then became a marker or badge of Christian identity. It was something that we did with our holy books in contrast to what other people did with theirs. And the trend must have started in the 1st century because it was clearly in place by the 2nd century. We can't be certain what the first influential Christian codex was, but my guess would be that the influential codex that started the trend was one of 4 things. The very first collection of Paul's letters, which would have been published by Paul himself and that would have included Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. If you'd like more information on this, see David Trobish's book, Paul's Letter Collection. Or it could have been the first gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark. Or it could have been the Gospel of Matthew, the most popular among the 4 Gospels in the early centuries. Or it could be a bound edition of 2, 3, or 4 of the Gospels, which would be something too long to fit in a single scroll. There are other possibilities too, but these 4 strike me as the most likely candidates. Is there any way we can shed light on the question of which it was? British scholar Alan Garrow has done a lot of work on the Synoptic Problem, the question of how the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related to each other. He advocates what he calls the Matthew conflator hypothesis, which is his name for what is sometimes called the Wilkie hypothesis. It's one of the solutions to the Synoptic Problem that I discussed in episode 57. Basically, the Wilkie or Matthew conflator hypothesis holds that Mark wrote first, Luke used Matthew, and then Matthew conflated Mark and Luke, as well as other sources. This has been my preferred view for a long time, though I'm open to arguments for other positions. In the show notes or video description, I'll have a link to where you can watch Garrow's videos arguing for this view. In his third video, Garrow makes an argument that involves the scroll versus codex issue. He points out, as of others, that when people were copying material from a scroll, they tended to do so in a different way than if they were using a codex. This was because of the physical nature of the book, the ease of maintaining eye contact with the text that you were copying, and the ability to easily move between passages. Scroll users have a greater tendency than codex users to paraphrase rather than copy word for word, to keep the material they're copying in the same order as in the original text, and to switch between sources less often. By contrast, codex users have a greater tendency than scroll users to copy word for word, change the order of the material they're copying, and switch between sources. In light of this, what can we say about the Synoptic Problem? Garrow uses these observations to play a game of what if and see what can be deduced about the kinds of books that Matthew and Luke were working with when they composed their Gospels. You can see his third video for the details, but we can say the following. First, Luke seems to have been using a scroll of Mark. If you're watching the video version of the podcast, you can see that here we have a long stretch from Luke 5 to Luke 9, with the portions where Luke was borrowing from Mark colored in. As you can see, Luke seldom switches between Mark and other sources, which is a sign that he's using a scroll of Mark rather than a codex. Luke also paraphrases Mark more rather than doing as much word-for-word copying, and Luke rarely changes the order of the material he's taken from Mark. All of this supports the idea that Luke was working with a scroll of Mark. And since Mark was the first gospel to be written, it also raises the possibility that Mark originally came out as a scroll, though we can't be sure of that for reasons we'll see. It's also possible that, even if Mark originally came out as a codex, this form of book wasn't yet in common use, and someone had Mark copied in scroll format, which Luke then used. Second, Matthew seems to have been using a codex of Mark. In the video version of the podcast, here we have a stretch of Matthew from Matthew 8 to Matthew 13, with the portions taken from Mark colored in. As you can see, Matthew frequently switches between Mark and other sources, which is a sign that he's using a codex of Mark rather than a scroll. Matthew also copies from Mark in a more verbatim or word-for-word fashion, and he rearranges the order of the material he takes from Mark. All of this supports the idea that Matthew is working with a codex of Mark. This indicates that the transition from scroll to codex was already beginning at the time Matthew's Gospel was written, which I estimate to have been around AD 63. So even if Mark was originally a scroll, someone was already copying it as a codex. Now we come to a fork in the road because it's quite clear that Mark was the first gospel to be written, a subject I'll tell you more about in a future episode, but there's a debate about whether Matthew or Luke came next. If you don't bring in the hypothetical source that scholars have called Q, there are two resultant possibilities. The first is the Farrar hypothesis, which holds that after Mark wrote, Matthew came next, and then Luke drew from both Mark and Matthew. The alternative is the Wilkie hypothesis, which Garrow calls the Matthew conflator hypothesis. It holds that after Mark wrote, Luke came next, and then Matthew drew from both Mark and Luke. Garrow considers both possibilities in his video, and he considers the Farrar hypothesis first, which leads to the third thing that we can say. In the video version of this podcast, I have a diagram of the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 5 to Matthew 7, with the portions Luke used colored in blue. If you look at the chapter numbers in the left-hand column, Luke takes bits of the Sermon on the Mount and uses them at different points in his gospel. He would use some of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, some in chapter 14, some in chapter 11, some in chapter 16, some in chapter 12, and so forth. This is not what he would do if he had a scroll of Matthew, so it looks like if the Farrar hypothesis is correct, and Luke used Matthew, then he seems to have been using a codex of Matthew. Garrow then looks at the possibility that the Wilkie hypothesis is correct, and Matthew used Luke. Here, we can use the same illustration because Matthew would be pulling from multiple different chapters in Luke, chapters 6, 14, 11, 16, 12, and so on, to compose the Sermon on the Mount. This also would indicate that Matthew is working with a codex of Luke rather than a scroll. We can thus summarize 4 things from this. First, it looks like Luke was using a scroll of Mark. Second, it looks like Matthew was using a codex of Mark. Third, if Luke used Matthew, it looks like he was using a codex of Matthew. And fourth, if Matthew used Luke, it looks like he was using a codex of Luke. Garrow argues that these and other considerations give us reason to prefer the Matthew conflator hypothesis because it allows both Matthew and Luke to behave consistently. Luke would be consistently working with scrolls, and Matthew would consistently be working with codices. These facts are certainly consistent with the Matthew conflator hypothesis, but I don't think that they provide a particularly strong reason to favor it. This seems to me to be the weakest part of Garrow's case, and the arguments he advances in the other videos are much stronger. There are also arguments he doesn't go into in the videos. So why don't these facts give us strong reason to favor the Matthew conflator or Wilkie hypothesis? The reason has to do with the availability of books in scroll and codex forms. Scribes were overwhelmingly used to producing scrolls, and it is unlikely that the codex trend began with the very first Christian books and then instantly dominated the Christian book world. Indeed, Hurtado's list shows that Christians were still using scrolls for centuries even after the codex form became dominant. It is thus likely that the first gospel to be written, Mark, was originally published as a scroll, something supported by the fact that Luke seems to have used a scroll of Mark. Further, books in this period were fantastically expensive due to the costs of materials and the hand copying by scribes that was involved. This means that if you were an evangelist, you would be incentivized to use whatever copy of a prior evangelist's gospel you had, whether it was a scroll or a codex. You wouldn't be likely to undertake the expense of having the earlier evangelists recopied into your preferred format, and even if you had a rich patron, he might not be inclined to go along with what he could regard as a frivolous expense. Nor would you be likely to slice up a scroll and convert it into a codex. That would produce a very damaged copy, as you would be slicing through the joins where the individual sheets were attached to each other. It would be hard to effectively bind them to a single spine, and the book would be extra thick, since scrolls were usually only written on one side of the page. The probability is that you would use the prior evangelists in whatever format you had. If Luke was the last of the synoptic evangelists to write, the reason for his inconsistency in how he treated Mark and how he treated Matthew thus might be due simply to the fact that he had a scroll of Mark and a codex of Matthew, and he didn't bother having Matthew recopied as a scroll before he set to work. I'm not saying that this possibility deprives Garrow's argument of all force. There is still some value in a scenario that allows the final synoptic evangelist to use his sources in a consistent manner. However, I do think that this possibility substantially weakens this particular argument for the Matthew conflator hypothesis, even though I think that this hypothesis is likely the correct solution. Can we learn anything from this exercise about what the influential book may have been that kicked off the Christian Codex trend? Earlier, I proposed 4 possibilities for what this book may have been. The first collection of Paul's letters, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, or a collection of more than one gospel. Let's consider option 2, that Mark was the influential Christian codex first. As we saw earlier, we have evidence that Luke used Mark in the form of a scroll and that Matthew used Mark in the form of a codex. So both forms were in circulation early on, but which came first? Since it would have taken time for the codex trend to become established in Christian circles, it is likely that Mark, the first gospel written, could have initially appeared as a scroll. This is supported by the fact that, as Garrow points out, Luke seems to have used a scroll of Mark. So option 2, that Mark originally appeared as a codex and it was the influential Christian book that kicked off the trend, could look less likely than the other options. On the other hand, there is also a theory that I'll tell you about in a future video that holds that Mark did not intend his gospel to be a polished, finished literary work. Instead, he intended it to be a collection of what were known in Greek as hupomnemata, which were basically collections of unpolished notes that could serve as the basis for later, more finished books, which is exactly how Matthew and Luke then used Mark. If this theory is true, if Mark was originally understood as an unpolished set of notes, then it could have originally appeared as a codex, since these were used as notebooks at the time. In that case, option 2 would once again be more plausible. What about Matthew, the most popular gospel in the early days? Could it have been the influential codex that kicked off the trend? If the Farrar hypothesis is correct and Luke used Matthew, then he apparently did so in codex form, indicating that the most popular of the 4 Gospels was already circulating as a codex. However, I think that the Farrar hypothesis isn't the most likely solution. So what happens if we assume that the Wilkie hypothesis is true and that Matthew wrote last? We have evidence that, in addition to using a codex of Mark, Matthew also would have been using a codex of Luke. That could mean that the influential Christian codex that kicked off the trend came out before Matthew's gospel. In that case, then option 3 would be less likely. But it also could just be that Matthew just really liked codices because of how easy they were to work with. If that's the case, then Matthew may have had Mark and Luke recopied in codex form so that he could use them, despite the expense that this would involve. Either that, or he may have had scrolls of Mark and Luke sliced up and then rebound as codices, even though they would be clumsy. In either event, he may have been such a codex superfan that he likely then published his own gospel as a codex. This would make the idea of Matthew being the influential codex that kicked off the trend more likely. But what about option 4, the idea that the book that kicked off the Christian codex trend was a collection of 2 or more gospels? The reason that this is a possibility is that all 4 of the Gospels are the right length to fit in a standard-sized scroll. So if you wanted to put multiple Gospels together, you'd likely use a codex, since codices can have more pages in them. What are the options here in light of what we've seen? Well, we have good evidence that I can go into another time that John's Gospel was written after Mark and Luke, and plausibly after Matthew as well. In this episode, we've seen evidence that on the Wilkie hypothesis, Matthew had codex copies of Mark and Luke at the time he wrote. So unless Matthew was the kind of codex superfan that we've just described, copies of Mark and Luke in codex form were already in circulation. And it's more likely that Matthew was not a codex superfan than he was, so codices of Mark and Luke probably already existed. In that case, they could have been bound together as a single codex, and that could have been the influential volume that kicked off the codex craze. However, if the theory is correct that Mark was originally meant as a set of unpolished notes, then why would you bind Mark together with Luke, the more polished work based on those same notes? That wouldn't make much sense. It would make more sense for them to be bound together later on, once Mark was recognized as a full-fledged Holy Gospel and not simply a set of notes. So I think it's more likely that Matthew and Luke were probably separate, that is, not bound together as a single volume, and this would remove a degree of probability from option 4. I thus presently think that option 4 is the least likely of the possibilities I've named. And we've just seen arguments both for and against options 2 and 3 being the influential codex. However, the one option we haven't considered yet is that it was Paul's initial letter collection that was the influential codex. We have evidence that I can tell you about in the future that this collection included Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. Thus far, I haven't found any arguments against Paul's initial letter collection being the influential Christian codex that kicked off the trend, whereas I have found at least arguments against the others. I thus consider Paul's initial letter collection to be a strong possibility. On the other hand, there are other options. We're not locked into just these 4. The influential codex could even have been an influential work of the Old Testament. For example, a copy of the Pentateuch or the book of Isaiah in Christian circles, or even an unknown work, though these possibilities are less likely. But one way or another, there was an early Christian book that came out as a codex, and this kicked off a trend that led to the entire Bible, all of its books, being bound as a codex, something that would never have been possible as a single scroll. Nobody would want to wind through hundreds of side-by-side pages in a Bible scroll, and the scroll's ends would be so heavy that when you were in the middle, the book would just tear. Eventually, all of the different books of the Old Testament and the New Testament would be bound together in that newfangled Christian book technology, the Codex, giving us the Bible Codex we have today. But what exactly the early Christian book was that started the trend will remain, until new evidence emerges, a mystery. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and smash the fire out of that bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making this podcast for years to come and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.